Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's Doing Business in the U.S. webinar, Virtual Expansion Planning with the Experts. My name is Sarah Larson. I am with Invest Buffalo Niagara, the Buffalo Niagara Region's economic development organization. Joining me are 5 panelists. First, business expansion expert Olivia Hill from our NBN offices. Olivia focuses on assisting Canadian companies considering an expansion to the U.S., and her services are free of charge to any business interested in expanding to the Buffalo Niagara region. Over the last 20 years, Invest Buffalo Niagara has assisted over 100 Canadian companies expanding here. Also joining us are 4 of the many partners we often work with here at Invest Buffalo Niagara when a company is interested in expanding to the region. David Lever is a principal at Tronconi, Segura & Associates, accounting firm. He provides international clients with expertise in identification and delivery of strategic business and tax solutions for entering the U.S. Phil Delmont is a partner with the legal firm Harder, Sechrist & Emery. He joins us today to talk about Canadian companies incorporating into the U.S. Phil's expertise include mergers, acquisitions, and franchise matters. Danielle Rizzo is a partner and co-leader of Immigration Practice Group at Harris Beach, where she focuses on employment-based immigration law. She represents Canadian citizens seeking entry into the U.S. Brandon Minsterman joins us from Key Bank. He is an experienced senior business relationship manager and will share the many banking services available to Canadian companies doing business in the U.S. Now that I've shared a little bit about our experts, I'd like our experts to learn a little bit more about the attendees with us today. And so here I'm going to start the first 2 of 6 polls throughout our presentation. So on our screen, you'll see the first poll. How long has your Canadian business been in business? And we'll give everyone just about 10 seconds to select, and then we'll close our poll and share. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. So here we go. About 32% have been in business for quite some time. And then we're split a little bit between 6 to 10 years, 11 to 25, and then the smaller percentage are early businesses or those that are celebrating 50 plus years of being in business. One more poll before we get started. We want to know, are you considering an expansion to the US? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So it looks like most of our audience is doing some research with the idea that they want to learn a little bit more about expanding to the US. 21% say, yes, I am looking to form a US corporation. Okay, this is good information for our experts to know today as they share some information with you. And now, without further ado, and before we get to our roundtable Q&A session, I'd like to toss the presentation over to Olivia Hill.
Thank you, Sarah. As she mentioned, I am part of the business development team here at NBN. I spend much of my time helping Canadian companies looking to expand to the US. There are various reasons for a US expansion for Canadian businesses. A key one is access to the US market. On this map, you can see what areas of the US can be reached within 10 hours of the Buffalo Niagara region. Our strategic location on the Canadian border is within 500 miles or 800 kilometers of 40% of the binational population. Other reasons for US expansion include proximity to customers, proximity to raw materials, made in US requirements or opportunities, and mitigating liabilities for your Canadian parent company. Buffalo Niagara's proximity to the Canadian border is a major benefit to locating in the region. Canadian companies can access both their Canadian and US facilities within a short drive. Other benefits of locating here include a 0% state corporate income tax for manufacturing companies, low-cost hydropower, a highly skilled and affordable workforce, and low cost of living. The team at NBN can walk you through a US expansion. We assist in a variety of ways, including what we refer to as cross-border due diligence. Along with our regional experts, some of whom you'll hear from later today, We educate you on the tax, legal, banking, and HR considerations for a US business. We also help with identifying suitable real estate and coordinating site visits, incentives coordinations and applications, local partner introductions, utility introductions, and more. And all of our services are free of charge. So whether you're thinking about expansion in the next 6 months or 2 years, it is never too early to call us. I recently assisted a Canadian company who began their expansion planning to Buffalo prior to the pandemic. Project Noise is an early-stage Canadian clean tech company who was interested in our region because of its proximity to Canada, access to their potential clients in New York, and an incubator opportunity here. The company spent the day with me and our cross-border experts reviewing the best strategies in accounting, in immigration, incorporation, along with other areas for their US business. We helped them explore and apply for incentives programs as well. Through the pandemic, the company has continued to move forward. They engaged with service providers, applied to a New York State incentives program, and signed a lease, all virtually. Now the company is ready to hit the ground running. While the pandemic has changed how we are doing business, we can still assist with setting your US expansion foundation virtually. Many of the topics we would cover in a day of cross-border due diligence meetings in person, we will touch on briefly today during our webinar. But I also continue to plan these days over Zoom with Canadian companies looking to expand. These meetings allow companies to prepare for their expansion and get specific advice based on their project. Before we jump into Q&A, our experts are each going to take a few minutes to give you a brief overview of their topics and any major new updates in their fields that would be relevant to Canadian businesses. First up is David Lever, principal at Tronconi Segura. We typically begin our expert meetings with tax and accounting considerations because those strategies can impact corporate structure. But first, here's our next poll question regarding tax and accounting. Are you selling and shipping products into the US? Great, so we've got some results here. It looks like about 30% are saying, no, you're not yet selling or shipping here, with about 50% saying somewhere between a 10% and 100% of your products are being shipped and sold here in the US. So from this, I'll let David take it away.
Thank you, Olivia. Just a quick overview of our firm, Tronconi Segura and Associates. We're about 120 professionals, one of the larger local firms in the area. In addition to our robust cross-border practice, we have some specialty areas in state and local tax, which we'll talk about in a few moments, and also mergers and acquisitions. In my role as the principal in our cross-border international tax area, we deal with a lot of inbound expansions in the US, and that can usually occur in one of really three ways: organic investment, by testing the waters, which is what we're going to talk about today, and also through mergers and acquisitions. So for companies that are selling into the US, and usually what happens in these discussions is that when we're talking about even about organic growth, as many of you answered in these last polls, you're finding that you really are already selling into the US. And when we were asked to come up with a timely topic for today, I thought this was a great one, because we've been getting a lot of questions in this area, because even though the border is closed or perceived to be closed, there are a lot of companies that want to get on with their business and continue their expansion. And so many of them have just started to sell across the border. So when we're talking about testing the waters or selling through your current operating company in Canada, we really want to focus on a couple different concepts. The first is from a federal tax standpoint, about whether the company is producing a permanent establishment in the US and subject to US corporate income tax, effectively through a branch or a division. Oftentimes, if you're selling into the US from Canada, even using a third-party carrier, under our statutory rules, you're considered to be operating a US trade or business. So then the next step is to look at whether the level of activity that the company has in the US gives rise to a permanent establishment. And usually that means some type of physical presence in the US. Having inventory solely in the US does not necessarily give a company a a permanent establishment. But if you're rendering services in the US or have other activities, then we need to take a closer look at that to see if the company truly is operating an office or a fixed place of business in the US. That's the permanent establishment terminology. In terms of income sourcing, a lot of times we look at where a title might pass, if it's through the sale of tangible personal property. And then we would look closely at the US-Canada income tax treaty. There are specific parts of the treaty that address the different activities that a company could have in the US. So then we would get into a really facts-based analysis about whether your company is truly operating in the US. So if they are, you would then be subject to a 21% corporate income tax on the profits of the US branch or the activity in the US. But even if you're not, one of the areas that we've really been delving into more and more are these tax treaty-based returns. And what these are really just are informational filings with the IRS on a corporate income tax foreign corporation doing business in the US basis. They're informational, they're an annual filing, and the tax treaty-based return states your treaty position and also says, okay, IRS, here are the things that we are doing in the US. We've analyzed this. We do not believe that it gives rise to a fixed place of business. We're not subject to any US income tax. But importantly, it gives us the statute of limitations to start to run, which is 3 years in the US. So there was a court case recently, Adams versus the commissioner. This was a vessel freight company that had been dealing off the shore, off the Atlantic, and they had not filed anything with it for a number of years. And then they started to file, and the IRS went back to early years, and because the company had never filed and those statute of limitations ran, the IRS came in and said, well, we're going to impute what we deem to be the gross receipts of the company for this time period based off of the information that we have. Perhaps they audited one of the customers of this Adams, and because 18 months had passed after the due date of the return, we're not going to allow you to have any expenses. And in this case, went to the IRS through the IRS appeals process, and the IRS actually won this. Again, so the treaty-based returns are a low-cost, almost insurance policy. But again, one of the ways that we try to mitigate exposure for Canadian companies that may be selling into the US. So the first step really is to get that analysis done, but there is some level of filing that has to be done, even if you don't have an office in the US. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the ways that Canadian companies do try to test the waters if they're looking to expand their business. So this is usually one of the topics that we talk about in the meetings that Olivia referred to earlier. So the other big issue with foreign businesses selling to the US are state and sales tax concerns. And this concept is called Nexus, which is a bit like the permanent establishment concept, but there's a lower level of threshold. Most of the states do not follow the US-Canada tax treaty, and they're sovereign states, and they're able to levy their own taxes. We often say it's like dealing with 50 different countries. Really, from an income tax standpoint, we really have to take a look at the activities of the company. Again, if you're using a third-party installer or somebody that's training or doing warranty work, even if they're not necessarily an employee of the company, they may be creating a presence for the company in a given state. So usually there might be some ways that we want to try to work around that. So the physical presence threshold for income tax is not as high as it is for the permanent establishment, but you still need to have a physical presence. So it could be inventory, it could be just some employees down from Canada to do some periodic work. But state considerations are certainly something that come up in pretty much every single conversation we have with expansion to the US. Sales tax is another concern. We have a dedicated state and local tax practice here at our office, and the reason for that is just because it's such a big issue now for companies big and small. We usually recommend that companies try to track their sales by state. There was a court case that passed about 3 years ago now called Wayfair versus South Dakota, and now we have this concept of economic nexus. So for sales tax purposes, a company that is purely remote, doesn't have any type of physical presence in the US at all, may be required to collect sales tax on the sales of their product if they reach a certain threshold that each state has designated. The most frequent one is $100,000 of annual sales into a state based on the destination, or 200 sales in a state in a given year. So there are definitely a lot of things that need to be looked at, whether a company is looking to fully expand to the US, because these same issues would apply to them and in terms of the state and local, or if it's a Canadian company that has been selling in for a number of years into the US, or is looking to do so, like I said, test the waters. One of the things we try to do in this area as well is to manage the risk. We may look at the amount of sales that a company has had into the US over a number of years, both from a federal and a state standpoint. Actually just had a call with a company that's been operating in the US since 2015, actually this morning, and very similar issues. So we're going to be talking to them further about how to do an analysis for them, and they may need to go back and file a number of returns just to mitigate their risk and continue to manage it.
Thanks, David. So our next poll question before we get into incorporation considerations is, what is your biggest concern with structuring operations in the US? All right, so we've got cost and time being equal, lack of knowledge, which is why you're all here today, we hope, and fear of the unknown. So we'll try to keep some of that unknown or make that unknown knowable. So Phil, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Olivia. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a partner with Harder, Seacrest, and Emery. We're a full-service commercial law firm with offices in Buffalo, Rochester, and Albany. We'll talk a little bit about the incorporation process and whether or not it makes sense to form an entity. I think, as David mentioned, there's no legal requirement that you form a corporation or other entity in the U.S. to transact business in the U.S. Certainly you can start by testing the waters through operating as a division of a Canadian subsidiary. At some point, your level of activities may rise to the level here where it makes sense to form a corporation. And really, from a legal perspective, what we're trying to do is isolate or limit your liabilities for U.S. operations to your U.S.-based assets, so that your Canadian-based company doesn't become subject to claims related to your U.S. operations. And so, if you're transacting business as a division, you would have to evaluate where your operations are situated in the U.S. Similar to the sales tax issues that David mentioned. If you're transacting business in a particular state in the U.S., you may have to qualify to transact business in that state. And unfortunately, like the sales tax rules, each state has different thresholds or tests for sort of what constitutes transacting business in that state. Typically, if you're just selling product from Canada in those states, you may not have an obligation to file for an application for authority to transact business there. So again, you have to evaluate your operations and activities to see whether or not any particular state filings are required. But again, I think if you're at the level where you're going beyond just selling product into the U.S., if you have employees here, if you own or lease real estate, if you have manufacturing facilities here, or if you store products here, it's probably going to make sense to form a U.S.-based entity for that purpose. And the typical structure is to form a corporation here. In the U.S., there are a number of different types of entities that can be used. You probably heard of a limited liability company, but I think from a tax perspective, a corporation is the most likely entity that would make sense for you. And the one thing I'd say is it's always important on the front end when you're evaluating your structure, whether it's to operate as a division or to form an entity here, you want to make sure your professionals on your legal, tax, and accounting professionals on both sides of the border are involved in that discussion to make sure that you're set up in the right way. So again, assuming that you're going to want to form a corporation here, the next question that often comes up is, what makes sense? What state should I incorporate in? Generally speaking, you can form your corporation in any state in the United States. You've probably heard along the way that there are some favorite states, and that there are some advantages to Delaware and some other states like Nevada from a tax perspective. But I think the key point in determining where to form your corporation, I think you've got to dig a little deeper than that and think about where your operation is going to be based. Are you going to have a physical location in any particular state? Are you going to have a multi-state operation? Because again, while there may be some benefits to forming in Delaware tied to sort of the things that people often think about is if you're raising capital or you're going to bring in outside investors, they often like to see a Delaware corporation. If you're going to be operating solely as a subsidiary of a Canadian-based company with no need to raise funds in the U.S., there may not be a need to form in Delaware, particularly if you're going to, for example, operate in New York State. It may make more sense to form your entity here. But again, it's a decision I think that has to be made on a case-by-case basis tied to your operations. That's a key consideration, is sort of really evaluating where your operations are going to be situated. And then from a process standpoint, the corporation process is a relatively straightforward process. And you file a certificate of incorporation or similar document in the state in which you're going to incorporate. And from there, you have to prepare organizational documents, bylaws. You have to elect directors and officers, and that's really all that's involved on the front end of the process. And then again, the analysis has to be made about where will you be transacting business. So, if for example, if you form your corporation in Delaware, but you're operating in other states, you may have to file what's called an application for authority to transact business in that state. And again, each state has its own analysis of what constitutes transacting business, and it probably falls somewhere between the permanent establishment and the Nexus test that David mentioned. It's probably somewhere in between in terms of the level of activities that may trigger a state filing. But again, I think that the key point is evaluating where you're going to transact business, and from there, your professionals can establish a plan for you about where to incorporate and in what states you may also need to file and register in.
So before we jump into immigration, we'll jump into our next poll. Is the border closed? All right, so 47% of our audience said yes, 53 said no. Danielle, why don't you enlighten us?
Thanks so much. Yeah, my name is Danielle Rizzo. I'm with Harris Beach. My office is in Buffalo, New York, but Harris Beach has offices all across New York State. So we're also a full service law firm. That poll question may have been a little bit of a trick question. I know it's been in the news that the border is closed, but that's not the whole story. The border is open for business, but there are different rules depending on whether you're talking about the land border or the ports of entry by air, so flying to the U.S. So for those who are flying to the U.S., there are no restrictions. You can still come to the United States as long as you've had your negative COVID test within 3 days of entry. You can still come as a visitor and take a vacation in the United States or do any of the things you would normally do in the U.S. However, the land border is partially closed, but it is not closed to essential travelers. And essential travelers include anybody who's coming into the United States to work in a status that has authorized employment. So there are several of those different categories of entry, and we're going to go over a few of the most common ones for Canadians that I see. So the first is TN status. TN stands for Trade NAFTA. NAFTA has been renamed the USMCA, but they haven't renamed the visa category, so it's still a TN. And it's available only to citizens of Canada or Mexico who are coming into the U.S. to work in a job that's on a list of 63 different approved professions. But it requires a U.S. job offer. So you have to be coming in to work for an entity located in the United States. And it also requires the appropriate credentials for that occupational category. So for example, engineers require a degree, typically in engineering field, or a license. So each category has different requirements. The major limitation of the TN is that it prohibits self-employment. So somebody who's a small business owner coming to the U.S. To open a company that you own, you wouldn't be able to be employed by that company in TN status, but you may be able to use a TN if you're planning to bring down other employees from Canada to work for the company. The procedure to apply for it is pretty straightforward. You present your application materials directly at the port of entry. An officer adjudicates it on the spot. If it's approved, you can enter the U.S. and start working on the same day. It's a $56 filing fee, so it's pretty cheap compared to most of the immigration options that are available. The second major category is L1s. Those are for intercompany transferees. And this does not prohibit self-employment. So I use this a lot for Canadian citizens who have a business in Canada. They're opening up a US business. It's available for a new business that's just starting up or an established one. But it requires that you have to have worked for the Canadian company for at least 1 full year within the last 3 years in a position that's managerial, executive, or requires specialized knowledge. And then you have to be transferring into a related US company to fill a similar type of role, either manager, executive, or specialized knowledge. And this also, under NAFTA or the USMCA, Canadians can apply directly at the port of entry. Canadian citizens don't require a visa, so you don't have to go through the consulate for this. So again, it's adjudicated on the spot, and when it's approved, you come in and you can start working immediately. There's 2 other categories I want to quickly touch on. These are treaty-based, E1s and E2s, and they are one of the very few 2 actually visa categories for which Canadians are not visa exempt. So these actually require that you go to the US consulate in Canada to file your application. There's one consular post that does all the initial E's, and that's based in Toronto. And because of all the provincial lockdowns that have taken place in Ontario in the last year, Toronto is very behind on processing these. So wherever possible, just due to the pandemic, I've been steering my Canadian citizen clients more towards the TN or the L if it's available, because these are taking over a year in my experience to go through the consulate. But ordinarily, they can be a great vehicle for entry into the U.S. The E2 is for investors who are coming to the U.S. solely to develop and direct a U.S. enterprise. You have to make a substantial investment. It can't be marginal just to support the investor and the investor's family. You have to be creating jobs for U.S. workers as well. And then there's the E1, which is for treaty traders. And the E1 is interesting because you can use it to engage in international trade, but the trade can be either in goods or services. So I've done this for a lot of service providers, and that would include IT consulting companies, management consultants, and businesses like that, where, as well as traders in goods. But you have to show that the trade is primarily between Canada and the US. And when it comes to trade and services, that just can mean you're a Canadian citizen, you're providing a service to US customers in the United States, so there's an international exchange there. But again, because of the delay with visa issuance, because of the pandemic, currently those are not the best options when it comes to timeliness of being able to get into the US.
Now on to our last poll. Do you have an existing US bank commercial deposit account? We'll take a quick look at the answer. So 27% say yes, 73% say no. Brandon, why don't you get us started with banking?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Brandon Minsterman, Senior Business Relationship Manager with KeyBank here in Buffalo. Just a little bit of a brief overview. KeyBank is in 15 states with 176 billion in assets. We're headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, but Buffalo is our second largest market and our Northeast regional headquarters with, a lot of employees and a major branch network. As far as myself personally, business banking, which is the space I play in, and I've been in for the past going on 20 years. We typically handle businesses between 3 to 30 million in revenue, and lending starting at approximately $500,000 and up. That being said, I can be your point of contact for anything that's needed, whether it's just some basic questions or if it would be, better equipped to be handled by our retail branch network. I could get a partner there involved, or if it's a little bit larger than the space that I personally play in, we also have folks from our middle market or commercial banking team that could assist as well. As far as client base, we do have a large amount of Canadian clients, if for no other reason than the obvious of our proximity to the border in Buffalo. From a capability standpoint, obviously full banking services, loans, lines of credit, treasury management services, wealth management services. As far as loans are concerned specifically, every situation is very different depending upon, is your business in the US now? Is it solely in Canada? Have you formed yet in the United States, or do you need some assistance with that process? And do you need help, once again, opening an account? Lines of credit we can often do on a smaller scale initially, but there's a lot of other products that, once again, can be very unique to your situation. So equipment financing, which we do for Canadian clients, oftentimes really the equipment needs to sit here in the United States for us to be able to finance that equipment, but there are other options available. So once again, it's a little bit of a specific situation to your business or what your needs are. As far as opening accounts and things of that nature, we can also help with opening up of deposit accounts. The good news with deposit account opening is that we are able to do that electronically. So especially with the COVID environment and the border, we can securely, safely open an account electronically with having everything, through PINs and DocuSigned, and securely help with that process. We also have a full foreign exchange capabilities. And so we can help you with, conversion of currency, and we have our own foreign exchange desk in Cleveland, Ohio. I think as far as, anything else with Canadian things with financing and lending, once again, I know I keep repeating this, but a lot of that is just specific to your situation. So we might, as an example, if, there's an established Canadian parent company, we would typically need to get the guarantee of that Canadian parent company, but, happy to talk to, email, over the phone, any specific questions that you have on obtaining financing, no matter what level it is.
Great, thank you everyone. Thank you to our experts for giving us an overview. We're going to go ahead and get started with our Q&A, because like many of our experts said, it is really unique to each business. And so we did ask you if you had any questions up front, and we did get some questions ahead of time that we'll go through. But if you do have any questions as we continue on over the next 20 so minutes, please do type them into your control panel question box, and we'll get to them. And if we don't get to all of them, we will follow up with you after the presentation. And you know what, I'm going to start out with one or two of the questions that I saw repeatedly, probably for Olivia. How long does a business expansion process take?
Oh goodness, that's a good one. It really is dependent on the business and the scope of the project, the complexity of the project. I would encourage a company that's thinking about expansion, even if it's just a small inclination, call us. It really doesn't hurt to call. Like I said, our services are free of charge. So rather start sooner than later. We can work as fast as we need to, but more flexibility with more time.
So the other big question was, what size of a company do I need to be, or what's that dollar amount I need to be investing that makes sense for me to set up in the US?
Wouldn't it be nice if there was a magic number? There isn't, and I think that's a good thing. So it can be as small as a small sales office here in the US to help facilitate your relationships with your US customers, or it can be a full-fledged manufacturing facility here. So really it depends on what makes sense for your business and where you are in your business planning. We've worked with Canadians who are going to hire one person or 100. So it really is based on where you are in your business and what that pivotal point looks like for you.
Phil, can you provide products or services to customers across the border without forming a company? What's the benefits maybe not incorporating versus the disadvantages?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no requirement that you form a company in the U.S. to operate in the U.S. As we talked about earlier, to the extent that you're operating as a division of your Canadian-based company, if you have permanent establishment in the U.S., as David mentioned, then you become subject to tax filings in the U.S. So you'll have to address that situation. And then the other piece of it is, it often makes sense to sort of test the waters to determine, am I going to generate enough sales in the U.S.? Does it make sense to expand in the U.S. before incurring the cost associated with forming an entity here? So I think the advantage of that is sort of again to test the waters. The downside is that again there's potential for your Canadian-based company to be responsible for subject to the liabilities of your US-based operation. So I think that's the ultimate decision as you move forward. At what level does it make sense to form an entity in the US to protect the Canadian-based?
Another one of the hot questions, and you really did cover this, Phil, during the presentation, is everyone wanted to know what state would be the best to incorporate it. And so a lot of times they do hear Delaware or Nevada, but it really, like you said, is unique to every business, and you really have to go through the process. Not to mention, Olivia pointed out some really great reasons why Buffalo Niagara makes sense being just over the border.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, unfortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think there has to be some analysis done to make sure what state makes the most sense.
Brandon, kind of along the same question of, do I need to do something? Do I need to open a separate account in the U.S.?
You would have to, from a banking perspective, have to form a legal entity in the U.S. in order for us to establish a deposit account. So from that standpoint, yes. But to Phil's point, certainly wouldn't want you or your business to incur any cost unnecessarily. So my recommendation is just to make sure that, that's the direction you're going before legally forming something.
A few questions when it comes to tax. And so this is where it really does become unique to a different company, but a couple situations posted here. David, I'm currently utilizing a warehouse service in Niagara Falls, New York, to store and ship my US bound products. Do I need to be collecting sales tax on those sales? Do I need to file a tax form on that?
Yes, Sarah. So just to jump back real quick on the bank account question, because it does have a tax impact as well. If you turn out that you do have to remit tax or pay a type of tax, it's a lot easier to have a U.S.-based bank account, at least with a bank that does the IRS accepts, which is usually U.S.-based. But to answer the question about the warehousing, yes, it's state by state. So if you had an inventory in a New York warehouse, you'd have to at least collect sales tax from New York State customers. You'd also have to determine if your product is taxable or not. And so you may have to file and collect sales tax on sales to your customers that are located in New York. Then you'd also have to go into the waiver that I talked about and whether you had economic nexus in any other states and you were compelled to collect in any other states. So it's a loaded question.
One of those hot questions coming in now is, what's the threshold for substantial marginal investment? So I think that might go back to the question that maybe Olivia answered.
Yeah.
When I think of threshold too, another one of the questions that was coming through was, at what point do I need to claim sales tax or to collect sales tax, right? There's those thresholds for the different states, and so that's going to vary state to state.
It is. The most common one is 100,000 of sales into a given state in a year, or 200 sales, but each state does have their own threshold. Again, it's either that or the physical presence, because the physical presence always gives you the obligation to collect in that state.
And I know we do have that documented state to state on our website. Here's another situation. All my sales to the US are from my Canadian website and shipping directly to my customers in the US from Canada. I don't need to charge tax on that since I am Canadian, right?
Yep. Again, that's where the economic nexus comes in. So that economic nexus is really meant for remote sellers. So you don't have to have a physical presence in a state. If you exceed one of those thresholds, then you may have to collect sales tax or at least a resale certificate. So if you're selling to a distributor or something like that, you may be able to collect an exemption certificate, but there's a little bit more work to be done to cover yourself. So you probably want to be able to track your sales by state and then have somebody take a look at it to really figure out, do you have an obligation anywhere?
So what if I start my sales in California with a Canadian company and then after worry about the taxes to be paid?
Yeah, that's probably not a good idea. California tends to be one of the more aggressive states. So we probably want to get out of that, in front of that. California has pretty aggressive not only physical presence rules, but also the economic nexus for income tax and sales tax. So we probably want to plan for that in advance. And actually, if you go to render services in California, your vendor may be required to withhold from their payment to you as well. So California is definitely you talk about red flags, that's a big one.
One more unique situation. If we have a U.S. sales rep, do we need to declare anything in the U.S.?
That would probably be another situation where we need to dig into further about what that sales rep is doing. We might at least file that treaty return that we were talking about, but we have to get into what the responsibilities of the salesperson are to see if they would qualify for treaty protection, and also to see if it would trigger any type of sales tax issues as well. So sales reps can go a lot of different ways, and what their tasks are, what they do, really has a pretty big bearing. Sometimes sales reps sell, but they also install or train or things like that, and those may not be protected activities.
All right, we're going to shift the topic to legal. Some legal questions to clarify, Danielle. Am I legal to start business in the U.S. as a Canadian citizen, and do I need to stay in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think this question is kind of hitting on both some immigration and corporate issues about whether or not incorporation is necessary, and it requires taking into account some issues on both sides of that question. But in terms of immigration, it really depends on what status you're coming in under. So for example, if you're coming in on a TN, generally you don't want to incorporate a company that you own, since a TN prohibits self-employment, so that would be a no. L1 intercompany transferees, there are different corporate relationships that can exist, and one of those is a branch office, which is an unincorporated entity that would be set up in the U.S. that's just a separate operating division of the Canadian company. So you wouldn't necessarily have to incorporate. And to that question about whether you need to be here in order to maintain that corporation, the answer is no. I have a lot of Canadian clients who have incorporated companies in the U.S. and they live in Canada and commute to the U.S. On their L1 as needed to oversee the operations of the U.S. company.
What limitations around Canadian companies having Canadians work at American locations? What are the limitations around that?
All the employees, anybody who's performing employment activities in the U.S. has to be authorized to work in the United States. So they would need to be approved for one of the statuses that permits employment if they're actually working. There are some business-related activities that fall short of actual hands-on employment, like attending meetings or negotiating contracts. Those you can do as a business visitor, which is a B1. Typically, you don't even know that you're entering on a B1 when you have a B1 because there's no documentation to show that that's the classification you've been admitted in. You just tell the officer at the border what you're doing and they let you come in. But the default admission period is up to 6 months, but limited by whatever you told the border officer you're planning on doing. And you can come in and go to meetings and that type of thing as a visitor without getting a TN or an L or applying for one of those work authorized statuses.
As an operations manager between 2 locations in both countries, would I be able to get a work visa and residency card? How much lead time is required and how long does it last, the amount of days it's allowed in the U.S.?
That's touching on immigration and some other areas also. So what I would typically see for that scenario is somebody getting an L1 for an intercompany transferee, and you would come into the U.S. You can either reside in the U.S. on the L1 or commute back and forth. Depending on how much time you spend in the U.S., it may trigger different tax reporting obligations. There's a residency test for tax purposes that has nothing to do with immigration. And I generally advise talking to a CPA who can advise on those issues. But yes, you can do it on an L1. For immigration purposes, there's no limit to the number of days you can stay in the U.S. per year. They're typically approved for an initial 3-year period. If you're a manager or executive, you can renew in 2-year increments for up to 7 years. That doesn't give you a permanent resident card. That's a temporary status, but there is a parallel path to permanent residency that you can pursue while you're on that.
So we have a theme of questions here. Now, we've all heard that the border is not necessarily closed. Based on the presentation today, our partners can definitely help you work through that easier. While it is maybe a little bit more difficult, for example, Brandon, accessing a U.S. account from Canada, how easy is it? How can I do it while I'm still in Canada?
I mean, very easy from the standpoint of just making sure that we set, you up with internet banking in proper channels that way. To be able to do, whether it's pay through ACH or get paid through ACH or wires. So there's a lot of options there where you really physically don't need to be in Buffalo or anywhere else for that matter in order to do your US banking from Canada.
David, so if I'm, I can't necessarily get some of my employees over the border, I'm utilizing a US-based installers, repair technicians. Is there an impact on me because of that?
Yes, there will. I mean, the big one is the state impact. Again, you would have a physical presence tax and income tax purposes. So you likely have to consider both of those. From a federal standpoint, you are sounds like you're already selling into the US, so you'd probably at least want to be filing that treaty return. But again, we'd have to delve into further what those folks are doing, and how they represent the company. There would definitely be some obligations, though, to at least consider.
And same on the incorporation front, Phil, how easy is it to incorporate while I'm not in the US right now, or to do it virtually?
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. There's certainly no requirement that shareholders or directors or officers be residents or citizens of the U.S. So we can certainly form the corporation remotely. In some states, you may have to have a registered agent, and that's typically, in those situations, you have to have somebody that's designated in that state to receive service and process if the corporation is sued. In those situations, we would typically have a filing service fill that role. So again, there's no requirement that the corporation have somebody based in the U.S.
We had some industry-based questions come through. Brandon, what industries do you or your bank work with and have experience with?
Really any industry with a few minor exceptions. So professional services, manufacturing. I know personally I have a large percentage of my client base in the manufacturing industry. Healthcare, restaurants, retail, really any industry that I mentioned, or any others as well.
And then as far as it goes with food exporting into the US, especially dairy, I don't know if anyone can speak from an accounting or a legal perspective. What are the concerns there about transportation, duties, tariffs?
From a tax perspective, milk usually is not taxable like sales tax. Physical presence wise, some of the specifics we might look at is whether you're delivering in your own trucks or you're using a third party to do that.
Yeah, and on the legal side, I would just add that there will certainly be some regulatory issues you'd have to consider with the U.S. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and other regulatory authorities that may come into play as you're importing those types of products.
Can you support a partnership with a suitable company that may turn into acquisition later on?
Absolutely. There's all kinds of structures that can be, as you're sort of moving to locate to the U.S., all kinds of arrangements that you can establish with a U.S.-based company to sort of, again, to dip your toe in the water, to start your activities here, and then with the intention that at some point you'll acquire that company to expand your U.S.-based operations. So certainly there are a number of different structures that can be put into place, by contract to put in the right agreement between the two companies.
And to add to Phil's comments there, one of the things we think about usually when we're considering a structure is who the other investors are going to be. So if you're looking for outside investment, like the Project Noise that Olivia had talked about earlier, they were looking for some US-based investors. So the structure was a little bit different than the typical one that we would have, just to try to make it more attractive to US investors as opposed to Canadian investors.
And I know from a banking perspective, the quick answer is absolutely yes as well. We can assist not only now, but we might be able to help as well with that acquisition and help with any financing needed. Or
just in general, seeking out that professional advice before you make a move, I think is a great idea to be proactive. It gives you more flexibility in how you structure things instead of having to try to retrofit legal advice when certain steps have already been taken. So, and also just for immigration, some of the filings do take a long time to be adjudicated. So if some of those can be planned for and filed in advance, that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the answers across the board are that it's pretty unique to your organization. So we're going to end our Q&A there. Thank everyone. And I think the question is, what's next for our audience? Well, next steps. Following this presentation, you'll receive an email from us with a link to 2 follow-up documents that will help you further get started with your expansion process. And then give us a call. We'll discuss your project one-on-one. The process is free of charge to connect with Olivia. And of course, you can connect with any of our experts. In the meantime, also, please visit our website where you can access a variety of additional expansion tools and also sign up for our newsletter to stay updated. You can also download some pretty expansive guides. So our experts' information is on the screen. You're welcome to reach out to any of them. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and especially thank our experts, Olivia, David, Phil, Danielle, and Brandon, for joining me today.